Dr. Marion Mass. She's a pediatrician and co-founder of the Practicing Physicians of America. If you are like many of our listeners, you subscribe online to the New York Post. It's probably one of the most widely read newspapers outside of New York City these days. And you've read a column she's written about baby formula shortages and the FDA. Dr. Mass, thank you so much for taking time out with us this week. How are you doing?
Oh, Joe, I'm doing great. I'm really appreciative of you having me on the show. And I'm actually traveling through your great state right now to my own great state. We're two liberty-loving states, aren't we? Virginia and Pennsylvania.
Well, if it wasn't for these two states, you know, where would we be? I mean, we'd be waiting for New York to do something. So let's start with the baby formula shortage. And your concern is one of many that this was a lot of regulatory hoops that exacerbated what may have already been a simple, issue with factories, not being able to produce as much because of COVID. Is this a series of incidents that led to a baby formula shortage that could have been made easier through our FDA?
Well, I like to break it down into a short-term problem and a long-term problem, right? So a long-term problem in that we have a quasi-monopoly. There's only like 3 or 4 companies making baby formula in the United States. And how did we get here? I mean, I like to use that Milton Friedman quote, put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert in 5 years, you'll have a shortage of sand. So
it's true.
But what people don't realize is we have a very precarious medical supply system in general in the United States. There are hundreds of drugs and solutions that are in shortage. Like physicians like me are getting emails from our hospitals every day. This is in shortage, that's in shortage. And I think there's been some 700 drugs and solutions and things you'd be surprised at that are on the shortage list, wow. Penicillin, saline, and we can talk about that another day. But there's a short-term problem and there's a long-term problem. Which one would you like to talk about first?
Well, let's start with the short-term problem because, you talk about, and we've gotten into this quasi, near monopoly on just the baby formula, but we see this so often with regulatory capture, perhaps under the best intentions 50 or 100 years ago, regulations are formed, but eventually people start figuring, oh, okay, and mergers and acquisitions and these things happen and no new companies come along. We were talking about it with one of our economic analysts and he said, listen, there was a time when if you sold your company to a bigger company, you could use that money to start a new company and go after the bigger company. And that was always just part of the invention process. But that just doesn't seem to be happening anymore. So nobody's making, quote, the better mousetrap.
Oh, that actually, I think that's even beyond medical systems. I think it crosses probably almost every bit of manufacturing in the United States. And then sadly, everyone goes for the cheaper option and then it all gets made in China, including our medications, which is another, we could have a third show. But to go to the short-term problem. So yes, we do have the regulatory agency called the Food and Drug Administration that's under the auspices of the HHS. And they've got a $6 billion with a B dollar budget plus and 18,000 employees. And you would think that something as simple as feeding our nation's babies would be front and center for them. This is a big concern and they should kind of have their finger on the pulse of the fact that if you're shutting down that plant in Sturgis, Michigan, and that plant was responsible for 40% of the company Abbott's formula output, and Abbott itself is responsible for 40% of all, baby formula in the United States. So if you're going to have a shutdown at that plant, you'd think they'd want to be not dithering about making sure that things got inspected quickly. But it took them 4 months to get, even before the plant was shut down, there had been a whistleblower case saying that there were problems in the plant. Sure. It took them 4 months to shut the plant down. And then even when the plant was shut down, it was because there were some infants that tragically died. Those infants had a certain kind of bacteria, found that's what killed them. And that bacteria was not even in the formula that the plant was making. So the fact that the plant remained shut down, it was a whole other series of problems. And it was then they were oh yeah, there's a whistleblower lawsuit. I mean, Where's the priority for our nation's babies? I don't understand.
Well, at one point, Dr. Mass, how many companies, and I don't know if you know this history, I'm curious about it, because we are, one company's making 40% of America's baby formula. I'm sure at one point that wasn't the case. I'm sure at one point there were dozens of companies, probably many of them local or regional, doing all sorts of different things, and eventually, just little by little, did it become so fragile where one factory could cripple an entire industry.
Exactly. And, if you think about it, for drugs that have to be sterile, like, chemotherapies, or for sterile salt water, for sterile glucose, for sterile insulin, your sterile EpiPens, all those things, they have to be very safe, because otherwise you can get someone sick by giving them. So that you're right, when you have only a few companies making something like that, if there's a problem in one place, you can cause a huge snafu. And, the other example is in terrible flu case in the year 2018, a terrible flu year. And there had been a hurricane in 2017 that took out the plant that made most of the saline, the sterile salt water. That's what you use when you rehydrate someone, right? And so the most of our saline in the United States came from one plant. And then everyone said, oh, it's all the fault of the hurricane. But that was the short-term solution. The longer-term solution is, wait a second, how come there's only one plant making most of the saline? And, that, as I said, could be its own show. But the baby formula, it's a particular way that most of the formula gets to market. So you were correct. There's actually 3 companies, Abbott, Mead Johnson, and Nestle, are responsible for almost all the baby formula in America. And in a way, there's a good thing about this, and it's because at least something is being made in America, because all of those are. So I like that part. I guess you do too, right?
Oh, sure. But could there be more? I mean, and that's what I wonder, were these all amalgamations of smaller companies that wound up getting absorbed into these bigger companies because they could afford to stay in the landscape a little bit longer?
Well, the way that you get into the lane in the United States for baby formula is the biggest entry lane is through the WIC program, Women's, Infants, and Children. The WIC program, it does some great stuff, because when I see patients that are, in financial need, and there's a lot of them now in the United States, and it's really sad. I mean, look at the state of our economy and, the job problem and the inflation. But patients that have economic need in the United States can get baby formula through their state's WIC program. Every state has a WIC program, and that WIC program is responsible, when you take all the states together, 40% of the nation's formula, well, more than 40%, comes through the WIC program. Each state does contracting with the big formula makers. And there seems to be the same thing that we have in the pharmaceutical world and the hospital supply world, where the companies making the formula pay what they call rebates. So I guess what they do is they pay the state, or they give the state a cut, and then they get to be the preferred provider for the formula for that state. Now, this has caused several problems in the baby formula crisis, namely that if you're in Kansas, and I'm not sure which supplier Kansas takes, but maybe let's just say it's Nestle. You have to use Nestle formula with your WIC coupon. So now if they can't find Nestle formula, they're really stuck.
Wow.
There have been some rules loosened on that, but you can see the other problem. Once you get that contract, then you get bigger, and then you can pay more of that rebate to stay in your position. In these cases, these rebates, they sound an awful lot like the kickbacks that I write about for the pharmaceutical world. And I'm kind of wondering if they are.
Yeah, but that was the first word that came to my mind. In the column you wrote in the New York Post, Dr. Mass, and we're visiting with Dr. Marion Mass, a great column in the New York Post about the baby formula shortage. You strike a chord that we've spoken about here on many different milieus, which is cutting of the red tape, because you accuse the administration of treating the symptom of the baby formula shortage without really treating the problem. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, until we figure out how these companies, until we can see these WIC contracts, which, I mean, everyone should be able to see them because, like, you pay taxes in Virginia, I pay them in Pennsylvania, and I pay them for U.S., and you pay them for U.S. So as a taxpayer, I want to know, like, are these formula companies able to pay off the state level government so that they become the only supplier? And if they are, well, then that's not fair because it would only be big companies that could probably afford to do it. And what are these rebates? So I think that gets to the root of the problem. And then as far as the short-term fixes and the regulatory, schmutz that we have going on there, I think we have to start, first of all, like, go out to the 30,000-foot view level. We're talking about babies and what's necessary to keep them alive. And not just, it's also the quality of their nutrition. I mean, when I trained in Chicago, we would always have children, and the parents would try to save money, and they would try to stretch the formula farther so that it would water down the formula. And when you do that for a baby, what happens is the way that their body processes it, they end up having a chemical imbalance, and they'll show up having seizures. It's really bad for your brain to do this. But, parents don't know that. And then now they're at even higher risk of doing so with the current formula shortage. And you would think that our federal government would say, we've got to do absolutely everything to make sure that we get more formula here. So look over at Europe. I mean, Europe has several baby formulas that they make that some of them are actually even considered healthier because Europe has more stringent requirements on not having certain sugars in the formula. But the FDA won't allow these formulas in because they don't meet the labeling requirements. So in other words, Italian infants and Swiss infants and infants all over in Europe are guzzling down this formula and doing fine, and no one's heard of any problem with this formula. But we can't let it in because there's a label problem. I mean, you would think that the label problem, in light of babies' needs, should be fixed in like 3 days. I just don't get it. $6 billion budget and 18,000 employees. Like, shouldn't that take two people?
Well, those 18,000 employees are all looking around for somebody to make a decision. If it's anything like the usual bureaucracy, Doctor. But what about, and I don't know if this was a large part of the baby formula shortage, but several news reports I was capturing were saying that part of it had to do with the increase in mothers nursing because of COVID-19 and the concerns about spike proteins and even post-vaccination COVID patients were even being encouraged by doctors to use formula rather than breast milk. Is that a big percentage at all, Dr. Ma?
Yeah, I don't like numbers on that, but if you asked me to, like, as someone with the finger on the pulse, I'll, every time I do a shift, I'll see 20 to 40 new patients a day. I would say people are nursing until we hit the formula shortage. They weren't nursing as long as they had been previously, and in part it might be like mothers, new young mothers, are isolated. Nursing can be hard. It can be really daunting and challenging. Not like with someone that's encouraging you, and if you think about it, in the pandemic itself, very few people were let in the hospitals. I'm sure the La Leche League and the people who were encouraging the nursing were not among those allowed in the hospitals. So I also think, I don't ever mean to shame mothers who choose not to nurse. And, you can see examples of this. There's mothers who feel anxious because they're on antidepressants, so they don't want to be nursing if they're on those antidepressants. Sure. And I think that's actually a solid choice. And frankly, weren't we all more depressed in the pandemic?
Well, yeah.
I would bet
there's a whole other epidemic of that going on.
Yes,
and also
probably a lot of moms on antidepressants that did not want to nurse.
A lot of single moms too, because I certainly know in my own personal world, having somebody to look after things if you're going to go nurse for a while, so that other kids are being dealt with or handled, and that kind of thing can make it so much easier on a mom, like you said, who's already feeling anxious.
Oh, 100%. And I don't mean to womansplain things to you, Joe, no. But when I nursed all three of my children. I was fortunate enough to be able to do so. But when you nurse, you're like a milk factory. You're actually burning more calories nursing than you are when you're pregnant. It's physically exhausting. So if you're doing it for like 3 months and then, further, the baby's bigger and you're burning more calories. So God bless these single moms who get to nurse at all, because it's challenging to start the process and then to keep it up. It's physically exhausting, and nursing children eat more frequently too. So, you're waking up at all hours. And as I said, not meant to shame anyone who chooses not to do so. But I bet if you looked, there were lots of reasons that maybe we had a lower nursing rate. And I can't, like I said, I'm not going to snow anyone. I don't know. I have not looked at those numbers. I do think we should be doing everything we can to encourage and empower women, to try to get there with the nursing. And I think it starts with the compassion, for motherhood and what a hard job it is, especially in those first few months. Without question.
We're visiting with Dr. Marion Mass. She's written a great piece, and I'm going to move off of it a little bit because you're the co-founder of Practicing Physicians of America. Tell us a little bit about the organization. I think a lot of folks may not have heard of it before. We hear of groups like the AMA and things like that. But tell us about Practicing Physicians of America.
We're a bona fide grassroots group, Joe, and we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We're pretty much run by our board in assistance to all of America's physicians and grateful to our members. People can join PPA for free, and we certainly accept donations because you got to keep the lights on. None of us on the board take any kind of a salary. PPA was formed at the end of 2016. We came on to the scene in a splashy event that we had at the Library of Congress in 2017. Our board consists of me and the co-founder with me, Dr. Wesby Fisher. He's a cardiologist in Chicago. We have another pediatrician, Dr. Nuran Al-Agba. She is a pediatrician in Washington State. We have Brian Jamal Dixon. He's a pediatric psychiatrist from Texas. We have a second Texan, because it's a big state, Judith Thompson. She's a breast surgeon. And then we have Dr. Roy Stoller. He's an osteopathic doctor in New Jersey and a surgical subspecialist of ENT. So we have a surgical subspecialist, a general surgeon, 2 pediatricians, a pediatric psychiatrist, a cardiologist, and we're from all across the nation and we're from across the aisle. And frankly, we just don't understand, why everyone has invaded our exam room. So we started PPA to try to make sure that physicians could train as they were practiced and have some autonomy. And then in 2019, I helped with the aid of David Balot, who was a former hospital administrator. We wrote a position paper on reducing waste and cost in healthcare. And that sparked the membership to rise of an organization called Free to Care. Free to Care is a coalition. So PPA is a member of the coalition. And then there's now 34 members of the coalition Free to Care. And we're 8 million citizens, 70,000 physicians.
Wow.
So we've offered really what we said in the Free to Care position paper was, stop it with the healthcare food fights. Don't talk about Medicare for all. Don't talk about repealing Obamacare. Those are non-starters because they're probably neither of them will happen. But what they do is they just start food fights. And instead of trying to make some big omnibus bill over what the healthcare landscape is going to look like, we offered, I think there were 32 suggestions in that paper of what you could do to reduce cost and waste. And, among them were like things that most Americans want, like price transparency. And, the drug pricing problem, we offered very specific solutions about, go after the low-hanging fruit. the middlemen in the pharmaceutical world, the pharmacy benefit managers. I mean, the 80% of the cost of insulin is going to the PBMs. Hit those dudes first.
Sure.
So we offered specific solutions, and people started paying attention. So Free to Care has grown to 8 million members. 70,000 of them are physicians, and we think we're offering better solutions than we've seen coming out in Congress. So.
Oh, sure. Well, nothing will succeed. Like you mentioned Milton Friedman earlier, we're running out of sand. Like you mentioned, the food fights. I think too often we look at doctors and nurses as, they're special or they make a ton of money or all these things, when we don't realize how important it is, and we shouldn't be looking at them as some sort of the villains in our society, when there are plenty of people who are driving up the costs without the doctors and nurses doing it.
Oh, 100%. And, it's really astounding, because then we sort of get the blame and we have the finger pointed at us. I don't know if you remember this, but when the baby formula shortage first came out, there was Jen Psaki and I think someone else, Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General. Mm-hmm. Someone asked them, what should you do if you can't find your formula? Oh, ask your pediatrician. Well, hello, thank you very little. I just explained how we got to the shortage. Now I'm supposed to fix it? I can't manufacture the formula.
It's crazy. Well, Dr. Mass, thank you so much. And we need to have you back on. We do several, big medical events a year. We need to have you at some of them because you're just brilliant. And I thank you. And that's quite a stunning organization you have there. And thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Oh, I'm delighted. And you know what? Don't call it my organization. It's our organization. Let's go team.
You're the organization you are part of.
There you go. Team, physician and patient.
And thank you very much for tuning in this week to all of this here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, where we dig deeper. We don't chase the headlines. We want to make sure it's about, all I guess the ultimate bottom line is that your freedom to go about how you do things can lead to your prosperity. Find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org. And until next week, on behalf of all of us here, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.